I work the graveyard shift at a store in Williamsburg, New York. For some reference, I live in a small apartment in the neighborhood of Kew Gardens, which is located somewhere in Queens, a bit off to the east, which means I have to take a long ride on the J train to work. It's not so bad, but there was always something creepy about the ride. I always thought it was strange how the city built the elevated subway line along a cemetery, as if it were orbiting the cemetery. My work hours were always weird. I had to arrive at work around 2 a.m. in the morning, which was always annoying because the trains, especially the J trains, ran with massive headways this late into the night. I started the walk to the train station. Finally, I arrive at the 121st Street station, my nearest station. The elevated platform is quite desolate. However, this is nothing unusual for the time. It's just me here. I have a look at the arrival board to see when the next J train will arrive. How typical. The board indicates that the train is 33 minutes away. The cold winter breeze sends a chill through my spine. It had been snowing for quite some time now. Snow was beginning to pile up on the tracks. It seemed like a blizzard was getting started. Not only was the train 30 minutes away, but it looked like this blizzard may delay it even more. I try warming my hands, but the dry winter air wins out as always. I decide to glance out into the darkness of the elevated tracks. I see what looks like a dark figure walking on the tracks as the snow becomes too much to see far into the distance. The man was treading through the snow-covered tracks. What was he thinking? I was most worried this idiot would slip on the snow and fall to his death down to the streets below. The train was still 30 minutes away, so I was not concerned he would be run over. I decided it would be best to keep an eye on him, just in case he was more crazy than he looked. I had a look over at the arrival board again, I guess out of impatience. Then, I noticed something new had appeared. The board was indicating that a Z train was 1 minute away. They must have sent it early. Then I think, puzzled. Wait, the Z train doesn't run at this time. I then remember the man walking on the tracks. He is still quite the distance away from the platform. I then see it, the glowing red eye of a Z train through the storm. It was climbing the hill up to the elevated structure. It began rounding the turn fast. Holy shit, he's going to get run over, I say. I begin shouting for the man to run for it. The man then stops, and the train speeds through him, crushing him like a rush. He splattered into a shower of blood and gore. I was shocked at what just happened. The train entered the station and came to a stop. I couldn't believe what I just saw. The doors opened.
This is a
The train
Brooklyn-bound
cheerfully
Skip
announced
train.
the next
The next
station,
stop is
as if it didn't
104th
just
Street.
run down a man. I could not risk calling the police. If I was late to work, I would lose my job and be on the streets. I took my seat in shock. The doors closed as if nothing happened. The train departed the station and started making its way toward Brooklyn. I'm sitting in the last car. The cars are empty as usual at this time. I couldn't stop thinking about what just happened. I glanced up at the display to check the time. I noticed that the LCD display was not showing its normal color. The Z was not displayed in its chocolate brown color I had become used to. Instead, it was showing a deep blood red. I figured it must have been a technical issue, so I dismissed it. I again thought back to the man who had just been so mercilessly run down. I decided I needed to look out the back window to clear my head. I got up from my seat and walked over to the exterior-facing window. I watched as the tracks went along. The sound of the tracks were so calming. Suddenly, a gruesome-looking face of a man jumped up onto the outside of the window. It was a bloodied man with a broken jaw, and his skull was flattened with shards of bone sticking out, and his eye was hanging out of its socket. I screamed and fell back to the floor in terror and shock. The train arrived at the station. A chill of cold air flooded the car. I looked over at the doors in anticipation. For some reason, I was afraid that it might get in, that he might get in. The doors closed, and I stammered back to my feet as the train left the station. I prepared myself again to see what was behind the window. I got up, and it was gone. I heard the sound of footsteps walking on the roof of the car. The lights of my car started flickering, and then they went out. I started to panic. The footsteps began moving toward the crossing between the cars. I now began to fear that this person, this thing, was again about to enter the car, this time through the doors at the crossing. The footsteps moved closer to the crossing. Then, suddenly, the car jolted as it made a slight turn, and I heard a loud thump on the roof of the car, then a second thump, and I saw the creature fall off the train and down to the streets below with a screech. I then realized that we were entering the 85th Street station, and I started to panic. I didn't know what that thing was, but now I know it can climb. As the train came to a crawl, I prayed that it would outpace the creature. The doors opened. A man in a hoodie entered the train. He noticed the sweat and fear on my face. He then said, "Is everything all right?" He was cut off when the creature entered the car through the open doors and jumped on the man. The doors closed behind it. "What the fuck?" the man shouted as the creature, with its snapped jaw, ripped into his neck. The man's screams were horrifying. I saw the grotesque creature continuously rip into the man's chest. It completely gutted him in front of me. The creature kept going as the man screamed out in terror, begging for mercy. The creature resembled the man who had been run down by the train. On top of what I mentioned before, the bones in its arms were sticking out, and it was using them as well to stab the man repeatedly. The train started slowing down for 75th Street. The man kept screaming in terror. It seemed the creature was done with him, as it bit down on his head and crushed it like an egg, ending his suffering. The doors opened, and I made a break for it. I ran to the next car up, and the doors closed behind me. I saw the creature in the car behind me lose interest in the corpse, and it started making its way toward the doors between the cars. I ran up the cars as long and as far as I could. In the third car up, I noticed that there were a bunch of people, but they were not normal. They had voids where their eyes should be, as well as their mouths had razor-sharp teeth. They were all facing my direction. I also noticed that they had badges on. They looked like some old transit badges. And despite them being eyeless, I knew they were looking at me, staring through my soul. All of them got up and simultaneously started approaching me. I pushed one out of the way and moved up to the next car. I reached the middle of the train where the doors were locked. I banged on the cab door like a madman, begging to be let in. I heard the click of the doors between the cars opening. The creature and those eyeless people all entered the car. I began to shake. I stared at the Cypress Hills Cemetery out the window. How ironic that I was about to be slaughtered and butchered outside of a cemetery. The creatures slowly began making their way towards me. I remembered that I always carried a holy cross around my neck. Well, I guess I should at least beg God for forgiveness. I grabbed it and started praying, knowing that this would be my demise. Suddenly, snow started ignoring the walls of the train. Snow started pouring in. I then saw what looked like Revolutionary War colonial soldiers manifest in front of me. Several soldiers from various eras appeared and faced the creatures and began to gun them down. The soldiers cleared out the creatures in a matter of seconds. I didn't know what the hell just happened, but all I knew was that those things were destroyed. The soldiers turned around, and one who appeared to be the lead soldier told me it would be best to get off at this station. The doors opened at the Cypress Hills station. All but one of the soldiers demanifested. The one who remained followed me to the platform. The doors of the Z train closed, and the train flew off the sharp turn and into a pit of fire. The pit of fire then vanished as quickly as it had come. Along with it, the late night Z train. The soldier told me that I needed to wait for the next J train. He told me he would wait with me to make sure I made it back to reality safely. I didn't question it. He told me that this line was cursed by another company. Long ago, when the dual contracts were being arranged, the IRT was highly bitter. It viewed the BRT as having a favorable outcome in contract negotiations. He told me some of them even took their anger to the grave. He said that every 5 years, a Z train will manifest during the late night hours of the winter. He said that the ghosts of the IRT members will then gruesomely kill anyone on board the train as an attempt to scare people off from using the BMT lines. I am then told that to return to reality, that I need to take the next J train to arrive, or he will no longer have the numbers to help me. I asked him why the MTA doesn't simply close the line during these hours to prevent this from being a risk to the public. He says that closing the J during the winter would bring more attention to the line and risk more people dying, but that the MTA is well aware of the problem. Of course, anybody who doesn't enter the Z train when it shows up at night is safe and is not at risk. However, even drivers are told, as a safe precaution, do not interact with any Z trains they see during the late night. A few seconds later, I see the familiar glowing eye and headlights of an R160J train. The train enters the station, this time at a slow speed, to respect the risk of derailment from the sharp turn at Crescent Street. The train came to a stop and the doors opened. The soldier, as I entered the train, put his hand on my shoulder. He then reminded me never to take a Z train if you see it when you shouldn't. I said I understand and thanked the soldier. The doors closed and he smiled and waved goodbye as he demanifested. The train slowly made its way around the turn. I looked at the LCD screen to make sure everything was normal. Thankfully, the J train circle was its normal brown color. I looked through the window into the next car. Thankfully, I saw a few normal-looking people having a conversation. I decided to report the incident to the police anyway. I called 911. The officer who picked up said in a weird tone, I should not worry about things that are out of my control. He then told me to have a nice night, and he hung up the phone. The train made another slow turn into the Crescent Street station. The doors opened. A few people entered the car. Thankfully, these were real people. I let out a slight sigh of relief. The rest of the ride to work went without incident. Of course, none of my coworkers believed me when I told them everything that happened that night. My manager told me to stop drinking before work, to which I said, "Fuck you," and I quit. A few days later, I started developing PTSD from the incident. I could no longer stand to see the J train rolling by on the structures above. I had a breakdown. I called my dad and I told him that I could not stay in New York City anymore. I told him that I had been fired. And a week later, he came over to New York, picked me up, and we took the ride back to Nebraska. The long drive home was well worth it to be away from that cursed city. That was the scariest night of my life. All I can say is, certain services only run during set hours for a reason. So the next time you're waiting for the J train late at night, just be thankful that it took 30 minutes to arrive.